sent out. I think many of you know Collin from when he was Secretary of DENREC here in Delaware, the youngest cabinet secretary in the country at the time to have been appointed. I was pleased to meet him then and work with him then on plastic pollution legislation. That we were just getting started on the single-use plastic bag legislation, which we finally got done. And thanks to him and his knowledge coming from California. So anyway, again, I don't think I need to read off his bio. I think you're all aware. Collin is now the CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, you know, the largest wildlife conservation organization in the country. And hopefully many of you are members, if not all of us. And Collin's just going to give us an overview tonight of his perspective now down in DC, covering federal issues and, you know, maybe how they hit home here in Delaware and how we can help at the federal level and perhaps even internationally with climate change. So anyway, Collin, I'm just going to turn things over to you. And if you don't mind, at the end, we'll save some time for Q&A too.
Great, no, thank you, Dee. And it's really an honor to be with all of you. And when Dee suggested, I remember going to the old green drinks a million years ago. So it's good to be here. And I love that Dee Durham is a member of the Newcastle County Council, right? I mean, to have an environmental champion on that body is just a blessing in many ways, and the results are proving it. Like, I have so many good friends on the screen. I don't want to name everybody, but there is somebody that you may not all know as well as some others on the screen, and that's my friend Mark Weiss, and he's with his wife Nancy. I wouldn't be in Delaware 13 years ago when Jack Markell had that crazy idea on St. Patrick's Day 2009 to announce this 29-year-old kid to be the Secretary of DENREC. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Mark. Mark was friends with Stephanie McClellan, who many of you know, and Stephanie obviously was helping Jack put together his administration, and that's the connection. So Mark, it's good to see you and Nancy. And actually one of the first people that interviewed me as they were trying to decide whether that was a completely crazy idea or not was actually Tom Noyes, who I saw on the call too, and so many other great friends on the screen. Look, I actually needed this for my mental health. It's been a rough couple of weeks in DC. I think, I actually got to know Joe Manchin pretty well when he was governor. He and Governor Markell, were friends, and Gail, his wife, and Carla became friends. And so I've known him for a long time. And I guess I'm here to kind of start with, don't give up on the congressional opportunities yet. I mean, we can't hit our goals of 50% reduction by 52% reduction by 2030, or even be anywhere close to a net zero pathway without the Build Back Better Act passing. I mean, the idea of trying to do everything through regulation with this Supreme Court, I mean, Jesus. And so we're going to have to figure out a way to get it done. We worked behind the scenes right after the holiday, try to convince Senator Manchin to basically say, like, the climate section wasn't the problem, which is actually a pretty remarkable thing. I don't want this to be a partisan conversation, but it's a remarkable thing that even the Democrats that have raised concerns about the Build Back Better package in its overall size or scope or individual programs have gone out of their way to say, oh, no, I'm fine with the climate part. So like Jared Golden, who was the one vote against the package in the House from Maine, he had concerns about the SALT deduction and other things. He said, no, I'd like the climate package. If we're voting on that, I'd vote for it. Kirsten Sinema, same thing. Obviously, there's other challenges with her today. And then Senator Manchin came out and said the same thing. And so I want folks to have hope. I'm still confident that package is going to move. Obviously, there was some good that was done in the bipartisan infrastructure, some good, some bad. But probably a lot more good on balance. But the major investments that we need to get to a net zero future are really in the second package. And for Delaware, I mean, it's a huge deal, right? There's some things in the first package that could help. I mean, I think Delaware could become a leader in green hydrogen. This is like hydrogen that's produced with renewable energy instead of with natural gas. And so it's a much cleaner way to produce hydrogen that's going to be needed in industrial processes and potentially commercial and residential heating, places that are really hard to kind of swap out or electrify easily. But the second package is where so many of the investments are for things like offshore wind. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think there's a huge opportunity. I mean, many of you have the old blue water pins that we all had back in the day. The opportunity is now. I mean, the prices are a fraction of what they were before in both real and nominal terms. It's going to be cheaper than a lot of other supply options, but the incentive to make it that kind of cost competitive is in the second package. It's in the tax package. It's the big investment tax credit that's going to be a grant instead of a credit. and it's going to be predictable for 10 years if we can get the package passed, a huge duration, which allows folks to plan. I mean, Delaware, I mean, it's as crazy as this is going to sound, Delaware is still in a position with a big play in offshore wind to be, and especially with NRG Unit 4 coming down, to be the first, kind of net zero electricity sector in the entire country. Like we could beat Hawaii, we could beat Vermont. There's a couple other states that are kind of in the mix, and we could actually be either first or second. I mean, there's a couple states that are going to be close if we go big on offshore wind, and we'll be hearing more about that with Dr. Kempton and others, I'm sure, in the days and weeks ahead. And we'll need everyone's help to make sure that's a reality. But and now same thing with electric vehicles. I mean, Delaware has lagged a little bit more on electric vehicles than some other states. We haven't had quite the incentives of like California or even states like Massachusetts. There's been some. I mean, Denmark's done some good things. We had some early incentives, but I mean, the tax package having between an $8,000 and a $14,000 tax credit for electric vehicles, all of a sudden makes them not the toys of the rich, but frankly something that's affordable to everybody. And one of the really smart things that President Biden and his team did is that there's not just a big tax incentive to buy an electric vehicle that's new. There's actually a $4,000 to $5,000 tax credit if you want to buy a used electric vehicle. And a lot of those still have pretty good range, 150, 200 mile kind of range for some of the ones that have made in the last few years. But that'll make it even more affordable to a bigger, a slightly bigger part of the population. The biggest challenge, I think, is going to be a supply side challenge, making sure there's enough cars available on the lots, because I think folks are really eager to buy them at that kind of reduced price point. And so hopefully the big three and others can be ramping up production. I would have loved to see more of that in Delaware, but obviously I don't think that's in the cards right now. But those two pieces alone, the clean energy incentives plus the electrification of transportation, get you a large part of the way towards a 50% reduction by 2030. There's also other pieces in like agriculture that could have some big benefits in Sussex County, trying to reduce some of the kind of the legacy pollution and reducing the amount of emissions that are coming off certain types of practices. There's some big opportunities in forestry that could have a little piece in Delaware, like in the Redden State Forest, but most of that's going to be out west or in the Great Lakes or in the Deep South. But again, you put together these pieces, and we're in a position both nationally and locally to actually achieve these goals if we can get this package passed. And so, I mean, we're fortunate in Delaware, and Senator Carper drafted a big chunk of the package through his perch at Environmental Public Works as the chairman. Senator Coons was in the middle of both the bipartisan package, as well as helping as one of his appropriator hat on putting together the Build Back Better package, and obviously having President Biden having climate be almost one of the most steadfast priorities he's had. I mean, I do have to say, I think it's saying, something that we had kind of big commitments during the campaign, and we worked on, and so many others on the screen, but then having those actually continuing to be top priorities during governing is kind of it's something we haven't always seen in the past. And so him not shying away from this challenge, and obviously the last year was devastating in many ways, right? I mean, the record forest fires we saw out west, the horrible hurricanes we saw, these kind of big swings in temperature that we're seeing. And again, there's a difference between weather and climate, but the intensity that we're seeing, the intensity of the flooding events, the intensity of the drought, the duration, in the West, I have a friend that says, we don't really have a fire season anymore out west. We have a fire year. I mean, they had, the horrible fires. I mean, some of us have on the screen have friends in Boulder, Colorado, for example. Individual neighborhoods kind of almost like laser strikes. We're just torched with some of these fires that happened just a few weeks ago. And so the urgency is there. And, I'm encouraged that, that because folks want to have a kind of investment-based strategy, there is a big opportunity. I frankly think a lot of the things that we're talking about in this particular package could have been bipartisan if it was split out from some of the other pieces, but other pieces are incredibly important too. Things like, pre-K and the child tax credit. I mean, these are things that are going to be game changing and lift, millions of families millions of kids out of poverty. So, it's important they stick together, but there is a growing bipartisan consensus for at least investment-based climate policy. The EPA regulations are still fairly partisan. I think there's growing bipartisan support for some of the carbon pricing and methane pricing solutions that are there. Senator Coons has obviously been leading that work with Senator Murkowski and Mitt Romney and others, trying to find common ground to make progress. And I think that could be something that comes out after this package. So the methane pricing could get done. I'm not sure the carbon pricing piece will in the current formulation. But again, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism. I think one of the challenges that we're going to face in Delaware is that as we're trying to lead on the emission side, we still are, continue to be kind of disproportionately impacted by the extreme weather and sea level rise. And so, if you're seeing, kind of the additional intensity of flooding up north on like the white clay or the red clay or the Brandywine, obviously we've had challenges in inland bays for a long time, but the frequency of these events is becoming more and more. And, the investments in resilience that, we were able to do with so many of you during the Markell administration, like they're working, but we need to do more, right? I mean, it's not just the beach nourishment, but the wetland restoration projects. I mean, some of the work we did up north in Old Newcastle and up through Delaware City. I mean, trying to make communities more resilient. But the challenge that we can't, at least for Delaware, we can't mitigate our way out of the problem. We're going to, or have we can't just kind of bolster resilience our way out of the problem. I mean, we're going to have to reduce emissions and kind of act locally and hoping that other, parts of the country and other parts of the world are going to do their fair share. I'm incredibly proud of the kind of the politics of the moment, because I do think that there is a huge opportunity to have game-changing investments. And look, we've seen this in Delaware before, right? When those types of investments are made and they're sustained, all of a sudden the private sector and private capital will follow. But I still continue to think that offshore wind is the biggest opportunity for Delaware. I'm blown away by the penetration of solar. And frankly, I think every rooftop, in the state and every parking lot and every landfill should be covered with solar to the maximum extent we can. I'd like to cut down a few less trees to put down solar, and that's still an issue that I have some concerns about in some places. But there's an opportunity for us to lead in the offshore wind space. But the other one I want to talk to you a little bit about today was around green hydrogen that I mentioned at the very top. And the folks talk a lot. We've probably spent 80% of our attention in climate conversations over the past 15 years on the power sector. And that's important. I mean, it's close to 30% of emissions. Up until recently, it was the biggest source of emissions. Now that's transportation, and obviously, electrification is a big part of solving the transportation puzzle. But some of the most difficult emissions to reduce are going to be in the industrial sector. So this is like making steel, making cement, making aluminum, making certain types of chemicals, and it's it's about 20 to 25% of emissions at home and around the globe. It's challenging because it's very fossil fuel intensive. It takes a lot of energy to kind of run those processes. And the options for reducing, there's some capture opportunities, but those technologies haven't quite evolved yet. There's opportunities to substitute different types of feedstocks, like cleaner hydrogen instead of using natural gas or oil. But it's a big opportunity, particularly for folks up north in Delaware, because some of the major sources of pollution, whether it's on the Delaware side of the line or the Pennsylvania side of the line, continue to be industrial facilities that I think are opportunities to both clean up, but also make sure we're still making things in this country. One of the things that worries me a little bit is I really don't want to be importing, all of our raw materials and all of our finished goods from China, where we know the pollution controls aren't nearly as good as they are in the U.S. The transport emissions, when you're moving things from one part of the world to another, are obviously very high. And there's a whole lot of folks that are really good at making things in this country that right now, haven't been kind of given a fair shot over, kind of years and years of trade deals that haven't really centered workers in a significant way. And so, that's another area that you're going to hear a lot in the coming weeks and months about kind of gray hydrogen, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, even purple hydrogen. And I'll just give a quick primer just in case I use shorthand. I want to make sure I'm not using too much shorthand. When folks talk about gray hydrogen, they're really talking about using natural gas and then using natural gas as a feedstock, and then typically using natural gas or kind of fossil fuel powered energy to break apart the methane molecules to split off the hydrogen. And so it's kind of a dirty feedstock with kind of dirty energy to produce hydrogen. And the amount of emissions from that process are actually pretty high. In some cases, actually dirtier than coal. Then folks talk about blue hydrogen, and the idea is to use, again, still have a natural gas feedstock, but then use natural gas that has like carbon capture on it, if assuming that works, to then split off the molecule. So again, cleaner because you have a kind of a cleaner electricity, hopefully, but still not perfectly ideal. The next category is kind of what they call purple hydrogen, which is kind of a crazy category because folks in DC like to name everything, which is this idea of using nuclear energy, which obviously has pros and cons, but it's obviously cleaner from a carbon point of view by far. Using that to split apart usually water through electrolysis process to split off the hydrogen molecule from the oxygen as a way to create hydrogen. And then the last one, what they call green hydrogen, is using renewable energy, so either wind or solar, or potentially even geothermal in certain applications, and using that to then use water to split off the hydrogen. So it's the cleanest option. And so you're going to see a lot of these terms kind of thrown around in the next couple of years. I think Delaware, because of our access to offshore wind and also the abundance of water, we could be a place that actually uses offshore wind to actually, split apart water molecules to create hydrogen to then power some of our industrial facilities to improve the way that we heat and cool buildings that are currently using either fuel oil or using natural gas. And so it's one of those things to keep an eye on. In the bipartisan package, there is an $8 billion program that is going to try to create regional hubs. And I think one of them could be kind of Delaware, up through Pennsylvania, up through Philly, maybe up to Trenton, and that area. But again, trying to make sure that we're both reducing emissions and creating a whole bunch of jobs at the same time. The other topic I just wanted to raise is that I've seen a sea change in the last few years in Washington on environmental justice. And I appreciate so many folks on this screen that were talking about environmental justice in Delaware well before the national conversation. And it's been a lot of leaders of color that aren't on the screen right now that have been doing amazing work. This is one area I would encourage folks to really lean in on. We're doing okay on individual projects in some cases. I think there were some good decisions that we were able to make, but I also rarely had the regulatory tools to shut down, or change a facility that was going to add a lot more pollution to an area that already had significant pollution. So we kind of think about like cumulative impacts. And so there's going to be more to talk about. I don't want to preview anything yet. You'll be hearing more in the weeks ahead. But states like New Jersey, states like New York, some others are beginning to look at, rather than just considering the pollution from an individual plant or a CAFO or an individual facility, start looking at how much pollution is already in the community and whether it's actually fair and whether it's at all equitable to have additional pollution in these communities that are already facing high rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses, in some cases high rates of mortality, as a way to try to make sure there's some more equities. President Biden's talked a lot about environmental justice, and Kamala Harris has as well. Mostly through an investment frame, talking about like the Justice 40, trying to have big investments in disadvantaged communities that have been historically underinvested in. Many of the places where plants are cited because it's a path of least resistance. My colleague Mustafa Santiago Ali, that some of you have probably seen on TV and stuff, talks about sacrifice zones, places that were a combination of like local land use planning combined with an insufficient state and federal regulatory oversight has really led to these communities that are just suffering from just decades of pollution that persists today. So as we're thinking with a climate kind of question, I would just encourage everyone to make sure that environmental justice and centering people is really in that frame as well. Because whether it's in Delaware or across the country, there are a lot of folks that are struggling because of the amount of pollution that are in their immediate community. So yes, and I am talking about Cheswold right now, and so many other communities across the state. And so I want to open up. I want to kind of have a conversation. I mean, I'm happy to kind of talk about, you all know me well enough. I can go on and on for hours, but I really want to get into a conversation. I mean, I think, I give the president a solid, B over his first year for B plus on climate, because I mean, on the regulatory side, they are moving a lot of things, the car standards, a lot of things on efficiency standards, EPA rules, but we really need this big investment package. My big ask would be just continue to lean on our friends in the delegation, TC and Chris and Lisa obviously are big climate champions, but we just need to get it across the finish line, and so every little bit helps. If you do have family in West Virginia, please have them call their senior senator. We definitely could use a little more pressure there. But on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, I mean, like, we're just grateful that there's been so much support for climate action, and especially in face of the pandemic. I mean, obviously the pandemic in many ways highlighted so much of the inequalities, highlighted the stressors that we're facing, and so many communities are already facing that just kind of exacerbated everything. I think it also laid bare, kind of how the climate crisis is also kind of systematically going to disproportionately affect different parts of the country. But there's some big opportunities. Another thing I probably should have mentioned was that there's a huge bipartisan effort right now called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I think I should put my National Wildlife Federation, my Ranger Rick hat on for 2 seconds. It's a bill that for the first time in U.S. history would ever fully fund the implementation of the state wildlife action plans. These are the plans that every state puts together to identify all the species that are in trouble. These are the kind of what we call the species of greatest conservation need. In Delaware, there's more than 600 species that DNREC and Fish and Wildlife have identified. It would help save the 1,600 species that are already listed. It would help invest in the 12,000 species across the country. Right now, about 1/3 of all wildlife species in the U.S. are at heightened risk of extinction. About 1/3. This is when they talk about the sixth mass extinction. this is what they're talking about. I mean, and it's primarily things, unlike other parts of the world, we spend a lot of money on the species we hunt and fish. So like deer populations are abundant, right? In most places, elk and pronghorn and mule deer in parts of the West are for the most part doing well. Duck populations are actually up, 56% compared to 40 years ago. It's everything else. It's the monarch butterfly. It's the piping plover or the red knot. It's the grassland bird like the meadowlark. It's the sea turtles. It's the Atlantic right whales. It's the sage grouse and the desert tortoise. It's the full diversity of wildlife that we haven't invested nearly as much in. And so my plug to all of you is that if you are reaching out to Senator Carper's office at all, let him know that the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is important. He's been a great friend trying to help figure out how to make it pass the Senate. But the reason I wanted to raise it with all of you is that unlike some of the other things that I talked about, there's 16 Senate Republicans that have already signed on to the bill. That's enough to get over the filibuster. And so, anytime you can get more than 10, from 10 Republicans on a piece of legislation, it's a big deal. It's largely the same coalition that passed something called the Great American Outdoors Act last Congress, which is what fully funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It also kind of created a $9 billion endowment for the national parks and national wildlife refuges and national forests and Bureau of Land Management lands and Native American schools. But it's a bill that would basically dedicate $1.3 billion a year to the states to implement their state wildlife action plans, another $100 million a year for tribes to do conservation on tribal lands. And it's a game changer. I mean, it's basically the best chance we have to try to avoid the extinction events that are heading our way without some kind of intervention. So with that, I do apologize. You all know me long enough. My speed hasn't really slowed down at all since you all first met me. I still tend to go a mile a minute. So I gave you 2 hours of content in I think about 19 minutes. But there's a lot going on. But I'm just so grateful for all of you keeping up the fight, whether it's in Dover or in Washington. And I look forward to seeing everybody in person. I'm actually calling from my house in Wilmington right now. But looking forward to seeing everybody hopefully in person when we get past this Omicron variant and hopefully things get to return to at least a little bit of normal. So with that, Jack, I'll turn it over to you. How are you, sir? Good to see you, buddy.
Hi, Collin. How are you? Just 10 seconds of background. I used to be a licensee of Wildlife Federation years ago. Collin knows that, and interface with him, various things. Anyway, you just covered everything, Collin. So I'm not going to go into all of that, but I do have a question with your permission. With all the things we talk about, hydrogen comes up, hydrogen comes up, hydrogen comes up. The optics of that in my brain are the newsreel of the Hindenburg exploding in New Jersey because it was a volatile gas. And they moved off of hydrogen years ago, and that was the solution. Help me with the optics in trying to explain that when I talk to groups. Why is it a good thing when this vision of the Zeppelin exploding with static electricity is burned into so many people's minds? Why is it good?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think the argument is that, obviously our ability to manage, these types of elements has evolved dramatically over the last several decades. I think part of it is it's out of necessity in the industrial sector in particular. We're going to need a feedstock, and this is the one that can be produced the cleanest. And so, I agree. We're going to need every kind of safety precaution that you can imagine. I worry about, there's some proposals for like really long distance, pipelines and things like that. I think, you want things kind of close to the end use, but, there are examples in other parts of the world, in Germany and elsewhere, even some processes in the mid-Atlantic, where this has been done safely for years. It's been typically with the dirtier version, kind of the grayer version that I mentioned. But I do think, like everything, right? I think, the challenge that we're facing right now is that there's no solution that's perfect, right? Folks in your neck of the woods, right, complaining about, concern about turbines being 13 or 15 or 17 miles off the coast, being able to see, half an inch of or a quarter of an inch of something. There's still obviously concerns about nuclear, but if nuclear plants come down, they're typically replaced by gas instead of renewables. And so I think it's talking about the safety. I think it's just being honest and transparent. And so, I think one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up is unlike offshore wind that so many of you have been involved in for a long time, I think hydrogen and some of the industrial solutions haven't had as much discussion. And so I want to create those spaces so folks can talk about it because it's a little more foreign. one thing I didn't mention, actually, just seeing it just reminded me of it. Another thing in the bipartisan package, there's $50 billion for clean water projects. And Delaware is going to get more than $400 million of between $355 million and another slug of money for kind of another type of project in the water space. It's a ton of money. And so one thing I would encourage folks to think about is pushing on our friends in the legislature and our friends in DNRAC to prioritize places that really need help. I mean, there's been some places, and I've worked with many of you on the screen on trying to help communities that didn't have access to sewer, for example. Some places where some places are using seepage pits or on septics. There's going to be an opportunity to make a big difference in like the inland bays and the Chesapeake side because of that money. And so when I saw your jacket, that just triggered that. So appreciate all your work on that issue too. With that, let me turn it to Nancy.
Thank you. So my question is, can you comment on developments in improving battery storage for renewable energies? I've read that we won't be able to get above about 70% renewable energy unless we improve the ability to hold energy.
Yeah, so yes, there is steady progress. The challenge is that it's a chemistry problem more than a physics problem, if that makes sense. And so trying to figure out, the different options, because the biggest option right now is just basically stack more batteries, right, and just have kind of more capacity that way. But there's not a lot of economies of scale like we've seen like with the microchip or other types of Moore's law kind of evolutions in the technology space. I'm still optimistic that. I like something that Willett Kempton and I talked about. Correct me, this had to be like back in 2009 when he was talking about using vehicle batteries, the vehicle to grid technology, as a way to basically as a storage device where you could basically charge your electric vehicle overnight. If folks had to pull power from it during the day when it's parked in a lot somewhere, or parked in hooked up somewhere, and use that to help stabilize the grid, that would make a huge difference. That would take that 70% to like 80%, maybe even 85%. But I think it's and there's also some technology around like water use and others with kind of trying to keep the energy. The losses are big. I saw another question from Fred about kind of hydrogen losses too. The challenge is these conversions, right, do lead to big losses. I think one of the places more so than battery storage that has the potential to help get us closer to 100% renewable future is going to be on the transmission side. Right, so having lines that are using DC to have so you don't have like the line losses. Trying to have more kind of more generation close to population centers, so you're not further away. If you had a smarter grid and a much more kind of efficient grid, and you had battery storage, all of a sudden now you put those two together, you can get to the kind of vision that you and I both want. Sally, hey Sally, how are you?
Hey Collin, I'm great. It's great to see you. Could you talk just a little bit more about the possibility of carbon pricing legislation?
Yeah, so I'm optimistic over like 3 to 5 years. I'm not optimistic in the next 6 months. We did everything I could. I was working with Senator Coons and Senator Whitehouse and Senator Hickenlooper and others trying to move carbon pricing conversation into the reconciliation package. There was some traction, particularly as it related to what they call a border carbon adjustment. So this idea of like having materials that are imported into our country that have a lot of carbon kind of emitted in the way they're produced or the way they're shipped, having to basically pay for that adjustment in like a tariff at the border. That had a lot of traction, and it's a carbon tax, right? Because you're basically saying that it's dirtier than what's here, and then you kind of equalize the playing field. And so I'm very optimistic in the long term. I think Senator Murkowski is one of the smartest, best legislators in Congress. We obviously battle on the Arctic, but she's pretty good on most other stuff. I think Mitt Romney's close to being there. I think there's Susan Collins is close. I think I see a path like 54, 55. I think the question is, is there a domino effect where folks realize that a carbon price is a more efficient and also more predictable way to achieve the reductions than EPA regs that may or may not survive the courts, or things that are ripped apart by one administration should the White House change hands. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I have more confidence in it because Chris is the lead author of the Senate bill right now. So I think that I'd rather have his hands than some of his colleagues. Don't tell him I said that. The others. But I think it's still an uphill. It's like one of the challenges we face is that there's been concerns in the Biden White House, and the concern is whether a carbon price, even with dividends or some kind of repayment mechanism, violates the pledge you made not to raise taxes on people that make more than $400,000 a year. And so they've been trying to work through that with like the dividend, and they've been trying to kind of make the case that folks are going to save money in the long run. And like between the energy incentives plus a carbon price, I mean, folks would likely see a savings of like $600-700 a year after a few years. But I think we gotta do a better job making the case on price. And so I'd love to work with folks. I know a lot of folks on the screen. I know Beth was on the screen too, that are working on this. I mean, I think that's the obstacle we have to come over, because there has been some demagoguery by opponents, right, saying it's just an energy tax, just gonna raise your bills. And we all know that it's actually going to level the playing field, have more renewables that are going to ultimately end up being cheaper than the fossil alternatives.
Thank you.
Hey, Peggy, how are you?
Hi, Colin. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Colin, I'm working with a group of organizations in Delaware that supports offshore wind, and we call ourselves Power People for Offshore Wind Energy Resources. And many of our members have been attending Stephanie Hansen's stakeholder meetings. I don't know if word of these meetings has gotten to Washington, but these are really cool meetings. I think you've been to one or two of these, haven't you? Yeah. And one of the subjects that keeps coming up is shortcomings with the grid. How do we respond? I mean, it's almost like we don't want renewables. What can we say? What can we do? And just how can we point in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different issues there that pop up, right? I mean, some use it as kind of an easy excuse, and there are some places where we need the grid to be more sophisticated to be able to balance the kind of renewables coming in and kind of where they're located. I mean, there's a couple things that have happened in the last couple of years. That artificial island project that was going on for a long time. That's the line from Salem and the kind of the Hope Creek and the Salem nuclear plant in New Jersey, that then comes across kind of at like Middletown, at Silver Run, is going to actually increase reliability across the entire system. I mean, I want to make sure that doesn't preclude our ability to go big on offshore wind. So that's one area. With NRG, with the Energy Unit 4 shutting down, you're gonna have a ton of transmission in Millsboro and not a lot of generation coming from the immediate site. And so that could become a distribution hub with offshore wind coming into that site and then being dispersed across the peninsula, not just in Delaware, but into Maryland as well. There are individual places elsewhere we have to improve reliability. I mean, I think there's some investments in the muni. The co-op's actually done a really good job improving reliability. The thing they get concerned about is like kind of modulation, making sure that like the system has to balance, because the challenge with the grid as a whole, and this is like what PJM does, they have to make sure that kind of the energy kind of produced and the energy consumed kind of levels across the system. Otherwise you have kind of imbalances that can lead to brownouts or blackouts or other problems. And so I think Peggy, I mean, I think one thing I would challenge folks when they raise that as a concern, have them localize it. Like, is it a concern in Newark? Is it a concern in, and have them actually talk about like what the concern they're trying to deal with? Because I think there are ways between the munis, the co-op, and Delmarva and the commission to actually work through the localized issues. And then that way you diffuse the argument as like it's like a statewide issue that's going to be a barrier to all these different things. I mean, there are parts of the country where the grid is so, I don't know, archaic, that there are massive problems. I mean, one of the things, like deregulation in Delaware had, kind of some good things and some bad things. One of the things that did, though, it actually incented Delmarva to have massive transmission upgrades that are pretty good compared to most parts of the country. And so our grid is actually a little more reliable than a lot of other parts of the country. Most of the issues we have are a storm comes through, a tree hits something, right? I mean, it's as opposed to like massive like line faults. It's usually some kind of natural disaster, leading to outages because equipment's damaged. And so I'm happy to work with you on this, maybe craft like a tighter answer. But it's a huge concern in some parts of the country. Delaware is not really in that category right now, at least from my point of view. Charlie, how are you, sir?
Hey, great. I'm a big electric vehicle advocate, and although I'd rather see carbon fee and dividend on a national scale, as you say, it may be a while before we get that. In the interim, I'm hoping that we can get something along the regulatory side, like, for example, everybody jumping on the California Clean Cars zero emission vehicle mandate, and maybe that'll go away once we get carbon fee and dividend. So what do you think of the chances of something like that? And at the same time, I'd like to conduct a little poll here. We as environmental leaders ought to be leading on the purchase of electric vehicles. Let's see the hands of those who have purchased an electric or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. How about it, Colin? Are you with us?
I have my Prius that's got 280,000 miles on it, and as soon as it goes down, like my electric vehicle is my next one. So I kind of drive my cars into the ground. It's my Irish side, I guess. But yes, it will absolutely be my next vehicle. So to your point, I mean, yes, I mean, Delaware should be joining the Clean Cars Coalition, especially as the incentive package passes. At that point, I mean, I guess I'm guessing we will jump on. I'm guessing they're maybe waiting for that. You know, a few years when I was at DNRAC, we were able to sign the low emission vehicle standard, which was kind of the first wave of that before the zero emission one for the ZEV standard. And so I mean, I think it does create market demand. I mean, I think we should be doing more, especially as the incentives are in place. To be pushing, make sure that the state, make sure that the university, that that all the municipalities, the counties are all, they should only be buying electric vehicles, starting, next year or the year after for anything that's, maybe not the heaviest of heavy duty vehicle, where there maybe aren't electric options. I think we also have a big conversation about busing in the state, moving all the districts to school, and all the school buses, as well as DART buses to electric over the coming years. And there's gonna be a lot of money for that. Senator Coons helped negotiate, I think it's like $4.5 billion nationally to electrify bus fleets. But I agree with you. I mean, I just think that, and it's one of those places where it's the right thing to do on climate. It's going to create a bunch of jobs. It's going to save people a ton of money in their maintenance costs, because obviously, electric charging is a lot cheaper than filling up with gas. It's a lot more convenient. You can do it in your driveway instead of driving down to the Wawa or the Royal Farms, depending on what part of the state you're in. And the other thing too is that it's a huge environmental justice issue. I mean, some of the worst pollution, we talk about power plants all the time, and we have to do more to clean them up across the country. A lot of the pollution that's affecting kids in cities is coming from particulate matter from trucks, right? It's coming from buses, it's coming from idling vehicles. And so the health benefits of electric vehicles is massive. And we don't talk about that enough. I mean, folks don't want to talk about the technology and the Ford F-150 and all these kind of exciting things. But I mean, kids are going to literally be able to breathe easier across the entire country when we electrify the fleet in a way that's going to be, I think, just transformative and just have huge impacts on reducing childhood asthma in particular. So, Charlie, I appreciate you being an advocate for it. I do encourage us all to get ready to buy them as soon as the tax credits come out. Mark, let me go to you.
Colin, sorry, can I ask you a follow-up question on that? Were you Phil?
Yeah.
Phil, were you going to?
Yeah, I was going to say, Charlie and everyone, we in the city of Newcastle have been proactive in that area. We have 2 new municipal vehicles for the administrator, L&I, and other people from the city to drive. And we jumped on the incentives last year and bought 10 charging stations and have installed 6 of them thus far. So yeah, we here take that very seriously as a plus and a definite need.
Phil, I really appreciate that, and it's funny. I remember I did an event with a guy named Shailen Bhatt, who used to be the secretary of DelDOT, and we put electric charging stations at the rest stop in Smyrna, and like folks thought we were crazy, and then we put them in the one on 95, and I've always been kind of the field of dreams, right? If you build like folks, it's not a chicken or egg problem. Like, you need the charging infrastructure if folks have the confidence to buy the vehicle to then use them. So I appreciate you guys leading, because it's been a long time coming, but getting rid of that range anxiety is going to be, and that plus the incentive, I think is the key to like getting the kind of deployment that we need.
And what's gotten some of the fear out of my mind, which my next car will be electric. A few friends of mine have electric cars, and it's unbelievable. You put your destination in, and the car almost tells you where it's convenient to stop and for how long to keep your projected destination in a safe range. So if someone almost 60 like me can understand that it'll almost make sure you don't end up in a dark roadway, then I think anybody should be able to handle it.
Colin, I just wanted to follow up on the what you were saying a couple minutes ago, because Charlie and I have been talking about this as follow-up to his question. It seems odd to me that DENREC's has a press release out and an upcoming public session and whatnot for the VW grant money, came out of the VW settlement. And but they're accepting applications for heavy equipment to move, to propane or better diesel than heavy diesel or whatever. And to me, that just seems it seems to me like they could be pushing the envelope a little bit more to just electric. And yet they're not. So I don't know, maybe that's more of a comment than a question, but if you have any thoughts on it, it's just frustrating to me that DENREC isn't, having that the VW settlement fund go just all electric.
Yeah, and yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I mean, I think there are some categories where there aren't kind of electric alternatives yet. And then the question becomes, are you kind of is the incremental gain from going to propane or gas from or CNG from from diesel or whatever it was, is that worth it? And I think I can look. I haven't seen the release, so I'm happy to take a look. I don't know what the incentive levels are, but I know there's in addition to the 20% I talked about in the industrial sector, that 14 to 15% in the agriculture sector is one that in particular is going to be challenging. And so I think trying to have some incentives to get things moving is probably important, but I'll love to take a look at it. I can get back to you. Mark, let me go to you, and I got a bunch of things in the chat too. I've been negligent.
Well, first, it's just really great to see you, Colin, and it's hard to believe that was 13 years ago, but thanks for mentioning it. And I think that was maybe one of the better things that I've helped do in life is bring you here, and we're really proud of you. So keep up your important work. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more. I know you mentioned at the beginning, because it's so vital on Build Back Better. What do you think is the realistic possibilities of getting it over the finish line in the Senate sometime soon? And what can we do to help make that happen?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and it's funny when I asked Mark about this, about whether I should consider the job, he said, "Well, you look 12, so I don't know how that's going to go over." So I still look like I'm 12, so I still, I feel like anyways, on Build Back Better, I do think it's going to get done. And unfortunately, and this kills me as an advocate to say this, I don't know if it's going to. I don't think it's an outside push that gets the parties back together. The president and Senator Manchin have to get into a room. Kind of staff has to kind of fall by the wayside, and they have to have a kind of a heart-to-heart about the importance of this moving. I do think Senator Manchin tried to send an olive branch by saying the climate package, he's fine with it, and that it's largely negotiated. And there's a few minor tweaks, but they're very inconsequential compared to the full package. But I think I had a chance to talk to Senator Manchin. What was it, the 11th? And he was still. His concerns were about other parts of the package. And I think what I'm struggling with, just going with my progressive brain, is how do you still have confidence that those other pieces aren't gonna be left behind completely? Because a lot of folks are hurting, right? And there's a lot of good in the rest of the package. And at the same time, we have a scientific imperative that if we don't act, we will reach a point of no return. And so, trying to figure out how to weigh those competing pieces. And what Senator Manchin said is that he's still fine with a 1.7, $1.8 trillion top line. So like the climate piece is about 550 of that. And so you got another, 1.2, 1.3 that you could spend on top of that, that you could fit a lot of good into. And so, I'd still put odds at, 80-20. I have to, because I can't look at my 4-year-old and my 9-year-old and think that, failure is an option right now. So, that may be rose-colored glasses, but I don't think we don't have a choice right now. And, given how things may shake up with the midterms and beyond, this may be our only chance to do something of this magnitude for the foreseeable future. So we have no choice but to succeed. So let me jump to the chat for a second. Malika, thank you for your comment. That's great. It's good to know. So I'm trying to get to some of the questions. Okay, so a question from Marianne. Since the US has many coal mines, why can't the byproducts of burning be captured before they enter the air? This is a great point. We have allowed fugitive emissions, as they call them, from not just coal mines, but from hard rock mines, from uranium mines. And we spent a fraction of the money that we need to cleaning up these resources. And so in the infrastructure package that passed in November when the president signed it, there's actually $16 billion to clean up and remediate abandoned mines, and roughly 12 billion of that is going to go to coal mines. And so the idea is to capture those emissions, but also kind of clean up the mines to the point where the land can be either returned into habitat, or it could be used for maybe like an industrial park if you can't get the habitat quality there. So that's a great question, and it's going to happen right now. Obviously, we don't have any of those in Delaware. We obviously don't have mines, but you're going to see projects up and down Appalachia, and in places like the Powder River Basin up in Wyoming, or some of the big mines in New Mexico that are going to see massive amounts of remediation because of that money. Senator Carper played a big role in writing that section too, even though it obviously doesn't affect his current state, but he was obviously born in Ohio and born in West Virginia, spent a lot of time in Ohio, so it was a big priority. From Jeanette, what is the chance of getting more green space and reforestation in our area? So, there is money. I talked about the Great American Outdoors Act. There's a lot more federal money. I'd love to have a conversation with y'all about updating the open space fund. I mean, that $10 million number was set when Lorraine Fleming proposed a package during the Carper administration. It's never been indexed for inflation, and we all know that land prices are a hell of a lot more expensive now, particularly during the pandemic, than they were before. 10 million is just, I feel like it's like a TV ad or something. Like 10 million doesn't go as far as it used to. And we should be, realistic about that. I'd love to see it indexed to inflation. We're seeing a boom right now in terms of housing prices and sales and realty transfer tax. Why not have a proportional increase for the amount that goes towards open space? And the thing I love about the open space program is that it leverages so much federal money on top of it, and can leverage local money. And probably the same thing for farmland preservation. We're going to see more and more pressure as folks can use Zoom to work from anywhere. They're going to want to live in beautiful places and then sit on a screen. That's why we're seeing so much growth in the beach communities right now. I feel like every time I turn around, there's another shell development going up somewhere. And so thinking through how we have tools to make sure we're protecting enough land. Florida had this conversation a few years ago. Obviously the rate of growth in Florida is explosive, and they made sure that 1/3 of all the money went towards land conservation as opposed to a fixed dollar amount. So all the realty transfer tax, it's a percentage they get as opposed to a capped number. That may be one way of getting at it, but I'd love to have that conversation, because we also have some equity issues, right? We obviously have more green space in areas that are higher income, less green space in lower income areas. It's same with tree canopy. We have more trees in wealthier areas, less trees in poor areas, and trees obviously they reduce urban heat island effect, they reduce pollution impacts, they reduce the heating bills. Obviously trees are one of the greatest investments we can make to help have healthier communities. And so Jeanette, I'd love to talk more about this, because I do think that there's a big opportunity to reset some of these conversations, particularly as the state is flush with cash. There are also some opportunities that Dee and I have been trying to figure out how to navigate at the county level, because there's a bunch of money that other states have been using because of the health benefits of land conservation and restoration with some of the COVID money. And we haven't seen that as much in Delaware. And so, I think I don't think it's a money problem. I think we got to work the politics, make the case, and then also tee up the projects. So anyone want to follow up on that topic before I jump to the next one?
Collin, I can tell you that there is a conversation taking place about the open space funding limitations and the need to increase it. And can you say again that 300+ million that you mentioned might be coming to Delaware is what will that be able to be used for?
So the 355 million for clean water is it goes in the state revolving fund. And so in a normal year, Delaware gets $10 million for drinking water, $10 million for clean water for sewer, and then we have to leverage usually 20%. So there's 2 and 2 put towards the bond bill. In addition to keeping that 10, and that 10 is actually more like 12 now, there's another $350 million. So basically, 50 to 70 a year for 5 to 7 years on top of that. And so, it's an opportunity to have a conversation about, some of the challenges below the canal. There's opportunities to have conversations and different places that being targeted, again, being very, very specific and not having planners make those decisions as opposed to, folks profiting just from development. But I think it's a lot of money and it's very flexible. And then also if the
It
money's
can
spent
be
on low
used
income,
for actual preservation, land conservation.
if there's a
or-
water quality benefit. So if you can show that's protecting source water or headwaters, you can use it, but it's got to have a complete tie to water quality.
Okay, thanks.
So we talked about battery storage. John Irwin asked a great question about the golf and the golf sale. Like this is one of the low points of the administration. What John's referring to is there was a massive lease sale that was in the Gulf of Mexico. Almost 100 million acres that were up for lease. Only a fraction of it actually got proposed for leasing. And one of the things that was interesting is some of the majors like Shell and others actually spent more on leases for carbon sinks than for actual drilling. They're identifying places where they think the geology right offshore could be places where carbon could actually be pumped under the ground, which I think we have to be careful of for a variety of reasons, because I think our geotechnical knowledge in some of these places is not nearly what it would need to be to do that at scale. But there's lawsuits going on right now challenging the environmental findings underneath it. It was an unfortunate situation because basically the judge said that he was going to hold the Secretary of Interior in contempt if they didn't take action because they didn't act early enough. They weren't really able to kind of get around that order in a timely way. But I'm glad that the damage wasn't worse than it could have been. I mean, if everything had been leased, it would have been just a catastrophic amount of emissions that would have been basically locked in for a generation. I also think that some of these lease sales are seeing very little interest, like in the Arctic and even in the Gulf, because folks see the future is electrified, and we already have enough leases for the next 30 years of oil at current consumption levels. I mean, like we don't really need to be leasing much more. I mean, like it's there may be surgical places where you want something for some reason. I can't think of one right now, but maybe somebody else could. But we really have to be weaning off as we're going electric. So Alicia Smith asked about the Recovering America. So it's the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's 2372 in the Senate.
Yep,
yes,
someone
so-
posted it, thank you, and I looked up the sponsors. It's a nice spread in both parties in both chambers.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, we've been working hard on it, and it goes from the very, very far right to the very, very far left, and everyone in between. So it's a microcosm of what they should be doing more often on other issues. Ruth Ann asked a great question. Ruth Ann, I know I owe you a call. I wouldn't. So I'd lift up. So Ruth Ann asked a question at 6:53. If folks are looking at the chat about land back and thinking about the capacity for tribes to actually receive land that was, just to be blunt, stolen, right, over generations, and returning it to the tribes. There's a federal process that's available for that, where the federal government will take the land into a trusteeship. States or tribes that aren't federally recognized yet, like the Lenape, need to be, but they haven't been recognized yet, don't have that same tool. And so we may want to think about creating a state. But Ruth Ann, I owe you a call, so let's talk about that. But I would encourage these folks to think about like the equity in the environmental space. The more land that tribes have sovereignty over, the better off for our natural resources. I mean, there's just it's pretty straightforward equation. I don't know, Ruth Ann, if you want to add anything to that. Question about smart grid. I think there are some smart grid opportunities in Delaware. I think one of the places that have been really successful in other parts of the country is at the municipal utility level, like some of the stuff going on in like Palo Alto, some stuff going on in like Seattle, places that have kind of autonomy outside of like a bigger kind of public service utility commission type of environment. If that's some things that folks are interested in, like let's talk about it. I think it's worth. This actually gets back to the question before about grid reliability. If folks are interested in a community that maybe is an immunity that has a high interest in solar, right? Having a microgrid that you could actually balance locally, so to basically eliminate all those questions around like reliability and making sure that it's kind of available at scale and also at kind of community level and more equitable. That's a great use. Also folks that are looking at some of the fuel cell technologies or other things that could be kind of the generation piece of a local grid, a local microgrid. So I think there are some opportunities. I think it's one of those things where I'd love to pick one great example somewhere in the state, do it well, and then replicate in other parts of the state. Jack, why don't I go to you while I'm scrolling through the questions?
Okay, just to follow up because it keeps coming up in the conversation. We all spend a lot of time on offshore wind. Everybody's for it. Everybody does a touchdown dance. It's great. However, I got very involved with Ørsted and the project off of, Sussex County, if you will. What I was shocked at, Colin, was the blowback was we all like offshore wind, but it became the argument of not in my backyard, put it someplace else with the transmission lines coming back. So my question, there's a question here, is where are we at with that particular project? Is that a go? Is it stopping? Is it what?
Yeah,
what's
so the Maryland
happening?
projects are moving. I mean, I should know the latest. I can look it up and get back to you on where they're planning on coming, kind of coming across. I mean, there's been some really good, thoughtful conversations about kind of going kind of deep underground, so it doesn't have impacts on some of the adjacent communities. And I think there were some missteps around the proposal before around Seashore, as they're trying to figure out is that as a potential pathway. My concern, and I think where I could use all of your help, is I think no one is going to want it in their backyard, but I'd rather see it one place than 20 places, right? I'd rather have and this is where Indian River comes in, or the Millsboro site, which is basically going to become a transmission hub after the plant goes down. You basically want to connect there, but I don't want spaghetti up and down the coast with a million lines coming across a million different places. Especially if it's above ground. I mean, you're going to create issues on the flyway. You're going to create issues, from visibility and for tourism reasons. And what you want is you want a big, kind of a big kind of high capacity cable, that's coming underground, kind of, a couple miles potentially, right? That's out of sight, but that has the capacity to handle a backbone almost. There's talk of this several years ago. But I think that's the kind of the honest conversation we have to have. And then what are the amenities? What does the restoration look like? How do you make sure there's no either health impacts or ecological impacts? But I think what worries me is that left to their own devices, individual projects will go to the point of lowest cost. But the problem is that then that's the least kind of optimal outcome for the broader public, right? Because the public's going to want to have it, have the lowest public impact. And I think we're going to keep having these fights. So I think it's a conversation that we have to have kind of out in public and just get people's thoughts. I also think that if we spread the cost across the kind of project, the net number of projects, the impacts on ratepayers would be negligible. It would be almost nothing. So I don't have a great answer yet, but we got to be better than we are right now. And I know some folks of the state are thinking about that as we speak right now, because they want to avoid the fight that we just had for 7 years about how to get the power from the nuclear plant onto the Delmarva Peninsula. I mean, that was just bloody and ended up in the courts and everything else, which is not optimal.
And just to follow up on that question, it's not only where the landing site is, but it's also there's a big push against, not the view shed issue, which is just what it is. I don't know whether Danny Van Drew's on this conversation, if she wants to chime in, or just if you have questions, she's in the chat and she can answer questions.
Hey, Danny.
Here, I'm happy to answer any questions specific to Ørsted. I can't speak too much to the U.S. wind project.
And those that haven't had a chance to look up Ørsted yet, I would encourage you to. And it's a company I've loved working with. I think that they're quickly becoming the kind of best in class in the region, and especially we did a lot of work with them up in Massachusetts. And so, and Danny, I can't say enough about your team. I think it's
Danny, you want to just introduce yourself, Danny, so everybody knows who you are that doesn't know who you are.
Sure. I'm Danny Van Drew. I live and work in Delaware and in Wilmington. I have my own small public relations and stakeholder engagement firm here, but specifically with Ørsted, I'm working with community engagement in Delaware. I'm their boots on the ground Delaware person. You might know me from work I've done with Delaware Nature Society before, or some of my Pew Charitable Trust work with Land and Water Conservation Fund, Open Space, CAFOs, all sorts of fun Pew projects. But I left my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. We are happy to talk to any group, anywhere, at any time, and talk about all the fun things of offshore wind. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you, ma'am.
Of course.
jump back to the chat. I got a great question from Dan. She asked if folks all seen Don't Look Up, folks that have Netflix, if folks all watch it. The question was just, was it helpful or harmful in the public dialogue? And debriefing dialogues could promote, eco-anxiety. I think overall, I think it's been helpful, right? I mean, it's still the #1 movie on Netflix, and it's got folks having a real conversation. I do worry that it's kind of preaching to the converted. And so the question is like, what's its reach, kind of beyond that? But the allegory, while not perfect, is obviously, somewhat telling. And look, as someone who's been bumped off, CNN and MSNBC from the, I was already in like the 7:45 slot, but then I get bumped because, Meghan Markle had a tweet that said whatever about Prince Harry. Like, I mean, I've lived that experience. Like, it's a little too on point, right? The fact they actually got on, it actually would have been funnier to me if they got bumped off the Morning Joe knockoff the first couple of times as they were trying to share the story for, something that happened, on TMZ. But like, I think that the biggest difference, right, is that it's not going to be the single, thing in the sky, right? It's going to be these million little impacts that folks are seeing. And then the collective action, obviously solutions are different as well. It's not as simple as just sending up a rocket, right? We need a bunch of individual actions. So I think good in terms of, spotlighting the insanity of the way that our system kind of, both media and politics, kind of handle these types of emergencies. Maybe not quite as helpful on the actual solutions, but some really smart climate folks were deeply involved in that, and we're obviously friends with a lot of the actors that basically spent a lot of time trying to make it both humorous and also somewhat educational. So let me see what else I got here. Oh, Fred had a great question. I don't know if Fred's still on. Had a great question about the waste of like the desert farm and other land, using land for solar instead of parking lots and things. One thing that we were trying to do at DENREC before that I'd like to get back to is paying the difference. Basically using, whether it's Reggie dollars or something else, to basically make it an equal cost. So when folks are deciding between a green field and a brown field, a parking lot versus something that's some kind of ecological system, that and actually not just make up the cost, actually make it more cost effective to have it in the on the brown field. I mean, I think there are additional costs for supports, and in some cases there's additional structure that you need. In some cases you can do like elevated parking, right? You got to go higher than you would if you're just doing a ground mount on a farm field. But I really want all those economics to work. The other thing too is there's huge benefits both on the health side as well as on the reduced need for transmission. I mean, if you're in a place that's already a parking lot for, there's a great example in Wilmington. There's a great array at Deltec's facility up on like Orange Street or whatever it is, that has this raised thing. And we basically in DENREC when I was secretary, we actually paid the difference because they were also looking at a site near their Sussex campus that was going to be a farm field. They were going to actually buy the farm for the solar field, which was crazy. And so I agree. I appreciate Fred's comment greatly because it's one of those things I'd love to work on with the county governments, or at least 2 of the 3 of them. Yeah. I didn't mean that.
We didn't hear you.
Deltec setup is around
trying to think. What else we got here? Lots of good meeting notes. Oh, so the question from Jeanette about Senator Manchin, what he wants. It's a dangerous question. So this is a 7:15 question from Jeanette. Senator Manchin's, I mean, I tested about a year and a half ago. He was one of the lead sponsors on the Great American Outdoors Act. And this was a bill that was going to fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund, like I mentioned, and fund this Parks Trust Fund. He was the lead sponsor of the bill. So I'm testifying before his committee. He's the ranking member at the time, Senator Murkowski, because the Republicans were in the majority. She was the chair. And he grills me for 3 or 4 minutes about why the bill, like what the bill is going to do to the deficit and what it's going to do to the long-term debt. And I actually said to him, I said, well, it's your bill. And I said, we're at the time, $25 billion, $24 billion in debt, none of which was from conservation, none of which was from climate, none of which was from, kind of environmental investments, except for maybe a very small bit of the recovery package. I mean, our debt has come from tax cuts and wars and, all kinds of other bailouts, very little of which has anything to do with the stuff that we've been talking about tonight. And he sort of, kind of liked that answer and kind of moved on. He is like legitimately concerned about the long-term debt. The thing that I've been impressing upon him is that the cost of inaction doesn't show up in that calculation. That if we don't act, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, probably every year in perpetuity, escalating over time, that we're going to have to pay in bailing out, communities that get flooded out, fires, drought, hurricanes. I mean, the cost of inaction is massive. And we know that for every dollar we spend on climate action, we save $6 in benefits. And so I've been trying to make the fiscal case. And like I said, his concern isn't so much in the climate package. I think in his ideal world, the child tax credit would be targeted a little bit more specifically at families, like lower income families. And so trying to lift, the millions of kids that are in poverty right now out of poverty permanently, and have that not be a 1-year program, but a 10-year program. He also wants to make sure that universal pre-K is a universal right, that it's not kind of based on state to state. And West Virginia actually was one of the early states to have pre-K. It was something he worked on when he was governor. And so there'd actually be a bunch of money going from the feds to the state to help defray some of their costs, because they were paying for mostly state dollars despite other budget challenges. But I mean, I know there's a lot that frustrates folks about Senator Manchin. I mean, having someone who knows him personally, like he's not making these decisions out of like personal profit calculations. I mean, I know him well enough, and it's frankly not enough money. I mean, I think there are concerns about his state, right? I mean, like he still has a base of employment that, it's a smaller percentage than it was before in coal, but it's still a lot of jobs. And it's not just the folks that are in the mines, it's all the other support services. And so trying to figure out like that transition, try to figure out, but he's also got, I mean, he'll say it to you, if you talk to him, he'll say, he's also got the highest rates of, some of the highest rates of child poverty, of infant mortality, of opioids, the opioid epidemic, of obesity, of other, respiratory and heart disease. And so he's trying to figure out how to solve all those things at the same time while being fiscally responsible in a state that, voted for President Trump by a margin of 40%. So I think I mean, my thing is, I can keep him talking. I mean, my thing, you know me a long time. Like if I can keep people talking, I can get to a yes, right? We can eventually find that place. And I think that's the same thing with Senator Manchin. We got to get him talking again. Because if we get him talking, then we can get to a yes. I'm trying to think. Okay, LEDs. Oh, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I love the work that's going on in state on the plastic side. I think there is an opportunity on the federal side. Basically, the idea is there's a bunch of different proposals, some of which are taxing plastic, some of which are creating massive kind of move towards producer responsibility. I mean, we've all been conditioned over the last like 50 years that plastic pollution is our fault, like recycling and all those kind of things. And like, I mean, and I worked with a lot of you to create the statewide recycling program in Delaware. We need to reduce the source material, right? We need to recycle more. We also need, less virgin material. It needs to be priced appropriately because we don't capture the externalities at all. And so that is something that, I think there's an opportunity for some bipartisan action. There's a lot of good bipartisan action a year ago on oceans plastics. And so I think we got to move that further upstream. And obviously folks are always afraid of levying some kind of tax, but it's not really, I mean, I'd argue it's basically a cleanup fee that you're basically, it's almost like when we bond for you put in a development, you have to have a bond in some cases, or, there's different types of remediation funds folks have to pay into. It's kind of the same thing. But I would just say, I mean, and this is something we need to do our parts individually, but we need like systemic reform in the way that we kind of use single-use plastic, because it's just choking our life systems in a whole bunch of different ways. And frankly, a whole bunch of ways we don't fully understand.
Are there things that we can do to support that act? As far as, I'm not a big plastic free Del. I don't.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That. I mean, push carper coons and.
Yeah, I think just get the delegation all on it. Yeah, I think just get the delegation all be on it. Yeah. I mean, it's not a particularly high lift.
Okay.
There'd be some pushback from some of the, folks that used to make plastics up north, but very little of the plastic still made in, that part of the, yeah, so. I appreciate Phil's comment. Yeah, it's a great comment. I have to read all this in more detail there. I'm kind of looking for question marks. Oh, Sharon's question is a good one. This is at 7:36 about third-party suppliers. I know you all get a lot of emails, a lot of letters, and a lot of things in the mail, and they do target certain communities more. I mean, I think folks have to decide what they're trying to accomplish with their energy bill, and one of the things that folks will say is that they have a lot of renewable energy credits that are part of it. Trying to figure out where they're from. In some cases, they're stranded assets from, Western Pennsylvania, which is great. It just doesn't bring a whole lot of clean energy onto the grid in Delaware. I don't think any one of the third-party providers have really figured out how to sell credits from Delaware projects and use that as a basis for for kind of arguing their third-party supply is kind of locally green. But I think this is one area we probably do need some policy in the years ahead. I mean, the point of deregulation in one way is to create supplier choice. But I think we probably need to do more to make sure that folks have a very clear idea of what the different options are, and like what the benefits are and what the trade-offs are, so consumers can make informed choices. But it's confusing for everybody. I mean, my wife's father, he was in Maryland. I think one day he got like 9 calls in the same day, same kind of example, and just it's kind of a free for all right now in these kind of wholesale markets. But I do think it's an area that a lot of folks want to do good. I just want to make sure the money's staying locally as much as possible to fund good projects, so folks are kind of seeing progress in their community and not just supporting assets in other parts of the country.
Collin, one thing, I was at a health fair last week, and Delmarva actually had a table there, and they said that there's a $5,000 cash amount available, which would cut the return time on the investment. And this was the company, the piece of literature that they were handing out. So that's pretty much a real live push by Delmarva to get solar more prevalent now rather than later, because the return, according to their calculations, seemed to be only a 5 to 6 year period versus, I remember originally, 10 to 15 years or even longer.
Charlie, do you want to say what you just put in the chat?
Sure, Jill. I had suggested that people might want to sign up for community solar, which is going to be coming to Delaware soon. We passed a law last year, regulatory structure coming out soon. There are companies in Maryland and other places around nearby us that have community solar. It's great. They can build solar farms on old hazardous waste landfills or someplace where the land is not usable for other sorts of things, provide solar at lower costs than what Delmarva Power is charging. At the same time, they have lower rates for low-income people as well. So lots of good things here happening soon in Delaware. Keep your eyes peeled for that and sign up for community solar. Even if you got solar panels on the roof of your house, you can supplement that in those times when you need power from the grid. Get it from community solar instead.
So
no, Charlie, thanks for that.
So folks who live in a very shady neighborhood or don't have the right roof, the roof going in the right direction, or have flat roofs, can tap into a community approach, right?
Right, or tenants. If you're a renter, you don't own your.
You're a renter. Thank you.
Community solar.
Cool.
Anybody who has an electric bill.
Yeah.
So the reg should be out by the springtime, I think they're saying on that. So that should kick off pretty soon.
Yeah, and then look, and that's one of those great examples. Charlie, I really appreciate you bringing it up, because I think it's one of those great examples of like elections having consequences, right? I mean, like the folks, there have been attempts at trying to do pieces of that for a long time, and then there's like little things like trying to have, covenants not be able to preclude solar and those kind of things. And Stephanie Hansen and so many others that you all worked with on that package, it's going to make a huge difference. We got to make sure we get the regs right. We got to make sure it's going to apply everywhere. But I'd much rather invest in a project like that. And look, and the economies of scale are real. I mean, it is much more cost effective to have one system, maybe on a parking lot or on some degraded lands like Charlie said, as opposed to every individual rooftop, right? I mean, there's an economy of scale that just benefits everybody in terms of price. So I would encourage folks to check that out, because I think it's great. I think Delaware could, first we have to catch up to a couple other states, but then we could really lead in an exciting way if we made it made some of the HOAs, like for example, across the state really wanted to jump in on. Sharon?
My question is, don't you have to be in a particular community that has community solar? I mean, I live in Newport. Is there going to be somewhere close to me that I can pay for community solar and tap into this, rather than pay Clean Choice, which promises me that they are just wind and solar, that they're not a fossil fuel company?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's on that wants to jump in on that. I mean, I know the original intent was to not have it just be for like folks that are in like, you know, individual HOAs or like individual, you know, municipalities, but that if you had a little bit of a, at least a handful of folks that wanted to come together, that they could work together, and then you can kind of partner with projects. So John, I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, anybody in a Delmarva power area can buy from a community solar project anywhere else in that area. So you do not have to be, does not have to be near you. It could be anywhere within Delmarva. So that's.
Okay, good.
I have a question.
You're
I
fine.
put it in a chat. You may have addressed it. Gail had to step to another meeting and maybe it went by then. We have a lot of parking lots. And if you take a look at like Deltec in Wilmington, they put up parking lot roofs that are solar. And instead of consuming farmland and consuming desert land and consuming a whole bunch of potentially useful land, if we're going to put asphalt down on a parking area and then heat up a car because the car is getting beaten on by the sun, wouldn't it be better just to do the solar on that? Do you have any perspective on how much impact that might have and what the barriers are to having that move forward far more?
Yeah, no, so I appreciate the question, and you're exactly right. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before, and you know, I mean, my thing is I don't ever want to cut down a tree for a solar field as long as there's another piece of pavement or another landfill somewhere that could be covered. I mean, I think we should exhaust, you know, every bit of surface parking, every bit of, you know, every landfill that makes sense, every, you know, brownfield that you absolutely can't restore to a, you know, ecologically kind of functioning landscape before. And like, and I think, you know, I use the example of the Deltec project when we were talking about this, because what DENREC did in that case is we actually paid the difference between the cost of a greenfield development for a solar field versus the, you know, it's higher, right? Because they're 8 feet off the ground or 10 feet off the ground, whatever they are, and they're, you know, there's a little more expense to that, but the benefits were many. And so, you know, I do want to make sure. I mean, my preference would be the community solar program. It kind of gives massive preference, if not, you know, kind of an absolute preference to, you know, any type of impervious surface, you know, development as opposed to any kind of greenfield development. And there's enough land, right, in most places that you could get, you know, kind of creative. So you're not using, you know, the habitat that we have remaining to, you know, to turn into solar fields. I mean, there's enough other options that are frankly closer to the load where the load is needed anyway. So you're not, you know, spending a bunch of money on transmission to connect, you know, to a farm that's, you know, 4 miles away.
Circling back to the efficiency, localization, et cetera, is there any organization, probably Department of Energy, but is there any organization that is taking a good hard look at, for instance, if I want to do hydrogen and I do solar to create the power to separate water into hydrogen and oxygen, and it turns out it's like 50% yield by the time you get to the hydrogen. Net, it's important to take a look at how we most effectively use our resources and do that. Is there an organization that is acting as a competent clearinghouse for this?
Yeah, I mean, so DOE actually created a kind of a hydrogen clearinghouse, so trying to like bring together more of the academic studies, because there are competing, and the challenge is almost everyone that's writing heavily on this has like a vested interest in the different outcomes. I mean, my concern is yours, which is it's the conversion. It's the loss of energy through the conversion. This is where, you know, using natural gas to create hydrogen that's being, you know, kind of blown apart by using, you know, kind of fossil fuel based electricity is dirtier than coal, right? I mean, like the numbers don't work. If you're using renewables and using water, right, like the numbers get a lot better. I mean, I think, you know, I'm trying to begin a conversation regionally, because I think we do have a lot of the pieces to actually become a leader on the green side, if we're willing to say, like, look, we want the standards to be high, we want the, you know, kind of the combinations to be in this form. But it doesn't make a ton of sense to me to, use that to use, electricity to create, kind of to release the hydrogen molecule to then run through, massive power plants where you were starting with electricity at the first point. Like, let's focus on the industrial sector. Let's focus on heavy transportation solutions, maybe some kind of localized, applications around fuel cells, but like the biggest need for hydrogen is going to be in the commercial industrial space. And so let's focus there instead of having a less efficient solution in the electrical space where solar, wind, geothermal are already more efficient. But I think we're always going to, the thing I'm worried about is that there's so many new technologies coming at people and everyone's out to kind of make a quick buck that we're going to have to, look at the life cycle analysis for all these things to make sure we're making wise decisions over the long term.
Sure. Do you have any sense of if any of the automotive fuel cell initiatives are really getting traction? I know Gore has some deep secret thing that they're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I think like some of the fuel cell buses could make sense, even though electrification is kind of catching up pretty quickly. Right. I think like some of the larger like shipping, some of like the fuel cells and potentially in the 18-wheeler space and in like the heavy equipment space could make a lot of sense because you need the power it's just the battery capacity today isn't sufficient for any kind of like long haul, right? Especially with significant weight. And so I think that's the kind of, it's not a niche application, but it's not widespread. I mean, Toyota made a bad bet like 15 years ago where they kind of doubled down on hydrogen passenger vehicles instead of electric vehicles. And they've been playing catch up ever since, setting aside their insanity with, Build Back Better and some other stuff. But I think I think it's going to be in these heavy applications, not the passenger fleet.
So, and by the way, we don't live in West Virginia. We live in a nice blue state. Is there anything meaningful that we could do to try to help Build Back Better and right-minded initiatives actually get traction?
I mean, just keep letting Chris and TC know you have their back is helpful. I mean, I think if you have family or friends or even distant relatives in West Virginia, trying to get them to encourage Senator Manchin. I mean, the case we have to make, and this goes back to a question before, like it's going to create a lot of jobs. It's going to save a bunch of money. It's going to improve, health outcomes in a way that's significant for folks across West Virginia. West Virginia disproportionately benefits from the package. I'm just given, kind of some of the challenges that they're facing. We just got to make it work for the in-state politics. And so Senator Manchin's encouraged me to talk more about jobs and savings, less about, emissions and, health. But yeah, just like if you have any friends and family, just anything we can do. I don't know what's going to, but what I said before, Fred, was that I think the president and Senator Manchin have to sit together and figure this out. Like it's not going to be outside advocacy. It's not going to be staff to staff. Like they have to have a real conversation that like the future of the planet's like literally on the line if we don't get anything done. It's a disaster for all of us if we can't pass the package.
Yeah, I mean, it's just too thin. I read an editorial. Somebody said I didn't vote for President Manchin and Vice President Sinema.
Yep. So let me get to a couple of other questions. Yeah, let me get to a couple of these other ones just really quick. Dee had a great question that I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking about. Newcastle County's thinking about its upcoming comprehensive plan. If you could do one thing in Newcastle County, what would it be? Southern Newcastle County, and by southern I mean not even below the canal, even just kind of the southern part of northern Newcastle County. There's still a lot of land that doesn't have the same level of development pressure that Sussex is facing. And so the question is, how do you conserve as much of that land as possible over time in a way that still allows some level of density where you want it? But I just think like comprehensive plans are only as good as the willingness of councils and planning departments to actually follow them. And so one of the things we've seen repeatedly in all parts of the state, all parts of the country, right, is like they're kind of like guidance documents as opposed to actual planning documents. And so I just think like being really specific about where you want to see growth and where you don't, is going to be really important. And I think there's less pressure than some other places, but there's still significant pressure compared to other parts of the country. So I don't know, Dia, I'm sure that's an unsatisfying answer, but I just think conserving as much land as possible. And it's a twofer, right? One is for quality of life and like aesthetic appeal and habitat. The other thing from a resilience point of view, I don't want a bunch more buyouts because we basically are allowing folks to destroy wetland complexes or other things for development that could be the bladder that saves us from, extreme weather in the years ahead. I mean, those natural systems and those buffers and those, those areas are going to become some of the most important areas for climate resilience if we have the wisdom to not allow them to be developed. There's a question from Ruth Ann that I don't know the answer to. That's John, you may or someone else may, about tribal inclusion in the community solar bill. I'm guessing that I'm hoping that was done, but I'm not sure. If not, we can probably fix that. Yeah, and then Dee's point on and trying to help industrial warehouses and other. I think it's great big roofs, great, much better than the other terms. So I know we'd covered a ton of material today. I'm happy to stay on. It's just so great to see everybody, but just thanks for actually having a thoughtful, uplifting, kind of hopeful series of questions. I was pretty depressed the other day when Senator Sinema gave the speech on voting rights. I mean, I just like to do it a couple hours before the president was coming to the caucus. It's this is one of those moments where we just got to lean in because like I said at the beginning, the cost of inaction and the consequences of failure are just almost unfathomable. And so I just appreciate all that you do. I appreciate what you guys are doing in municipalities and the counties and at the state level and at the federal level. And I would just encourage you to lean in more. I mean, this is one of those times where I do think when we look back, years from now, these couple of years are going to be the inflection point, either, for good or not. And that's still very much up in the air. But, the decisions that are made in the next 6 months are going to have just massive impacts on the trajectory of over the coming decades. And so I had an old coach that used to say, we got to leave it all on the field. And I think this is one of those times where we got to be great advocates because, we got to leave it on the field because we need to succeed. There's just no other alternative.
Collin, I cannot thank you enough. And I know you are definitely preaching to the choir here. This is the whole group of people who everybody is doing their best. And I hear you're saying, this is not the time to slack. This is the time to, put your big girl pants on and do more and more and more and more. So I guess that's kind of a call to action. And I hope that you will join us again in our endeavor and bring us up to speed. For me, it's very nice to know that Senator Manchin is not a huge ogre, but is a person who is balancing many different forces, which is kind of what politics is about. It's easy to kind of demonize these folks. So but we will certainly, everybody can write him a note and say, hey, we want you to get this Build Back Better, and especially the climate part of it rolling. So thank you. And Dee, we put this recording out on our Facebook. If you guys would go and like us on Facebook, that would be fabulous. That gives us more visibility on the world and gets more people hopefully involved and energized and all that kind of good stuff. Do you have any other thoughts?
But just to add, a few people asked for the chat, so I'll save the chat and send it out to everyone. Lots of great links in there. And Collin, can't thank you enough for joining us tonight, taking time out of your day and Martin Luther King Day to be here with us. So thank you. We do appreciate it very much, and glad you're hopeful for the future.
I have no alternative. When I look into the face of my 4-year-old in particular, right? I mean, I can't.
I'm super happy that you're in Delaware.
Well, and then there's the last thing I was going to say. If there's things that you're working on that I can help with, again, things are always kind of crazy, but just let me know, or even just keep me abreast of different initiatives, because we can connect dots, and some of it's successful and some of it isn't. But I think there's so much good energy right now, and I think there's some huge opportunities. And so anything I can do to help. So I put my email in the chat. Use it. Everybody else does. So just anything I can do to help, because we just I love the energy of this space. I just appreciate you guys kind of cultivating it and having good action come out of it.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and come and learn more about offshore wind with Willa Kempton on the 21st. and have a wonderful rest of your Martin Luther King Day.